This video is an educational documentary based on publicly available records, court documents, and official reports. Hi friends, my name is Jake, and today we're diving into the 10 darkest murder cases from Canada with shocking twists that left investigators and locals stunned. Case 1. Travis Brandon Baumgartner. On a quiet summer night in June, a routine job turned into one of the most shocking workplace tragedies in Canadian history. The events unfolded without warning, without chaos at first glance, and without any sign that something was about to go terribly wrong. This is the story of how trust was broken, how a plan quietly formed, and how a single decision forever altered multiple lives at the University of Alberta campus in Edmonton. In the early hours of June 15, 2012, a cash delivery crew from G4S Cash Solutions arrived at a familiar stop. The task was simple, something they had done countless times before: restock ATMs and move on. None of them suspected that one person among them had already decided this night would end differently. The youngest member of the team, Travis Baumgartner, was only 21 years old. He was new to the job, physically imposing, quiet, and outwardly unremarkable. Yet beneath that surface, financial stress and resentment had been building for months. Baumgartner was deeply in debt. He owed tens of thousands of dollars on a recently purchased truck, had almost no money in his bank account, and had argued with his mother about rent just hours before his shift began. According to later testimony, he left home that evening, telling her she would get her money and that he would not be coming back. As the armored vehicle stopped near Hube Mall at the University of Alberta, the crew split into positions. 4 guards entered a secure ATM vestibule, while another remained outside by the truck. The environment was calm, students were nearby, trains still moved underground, and the campus felt normal. That normality ended in seconds. Without raising suspicion, Baumgartner positioned himself behind his co-workers. When the moment came, he carried out a sudden and deliberate attack at close range. 3 guards inside the vestibule were struck before they could react. 2 of them, Michelle Shigelski and Brian Ilisic, lost their lives almost instantly. A third, Matthew Schumann, survived but suffered catastrophic brain injuries. The noise echoed through the enclosed space, disorienting and final. Baumgartner then exited the building, reloaded his weapon, and approached the guard waiting outside. Edgardo Rejano, who had been watching over the operation, was struck and later died at the scene. The entire sequence lasted only minutes, yet the consequences would last forever. Inside the locked vestibule, Schumann was conscious, injured, and trapped. His calls for help were soon heard by passing students, who discovered blood seeping under the door and alerted authorities. Police arrived quickly, forced entry, and began emergency care. But by then, the attacker was already gone. Baumgartner drove the armored truck away, abandoned it near the company compound, transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars into his personal vehicle, and disappeared. As Edmonton woke up to the news, confusion spread. Was this an outside robbery? Had the missing guard been taken hostage? For several hours, investigators were unsure. By midday, the reality became clear. This was not an external threat. It was an inside betrayal. A nationwide search began. Baumgartner had changed license plates, discarded company equipment, and headed west. He stopped at friends' homes to leave cash behind, then returned briefly to his mother's house, placing a large sum of money on the kitchen table before leaving again. 2 days later, his attempt to cross into the United States failed. Border scanners flagged his vehicle, and he was arrested without resistance. He carried over $330,000 in cash, no passport, and no clear plan. Once in custody, Baumgartner initially claimed he had no memory of events, spinning a story involving abduction and threats to his family. That story collapsed after an undercover officer engaged him in conversation. In a moment that would later be played in court, Baumgartner admitted responsibility, stating plainly that he had carried out the attack and taken the money. His words offered no deeper explanation, only confirmation. In court, the impact statements painted a devastating picture. Families spoke of futures erased, children growing up without parents, and lives permanently altered. Schumann's injuries ended his career, his independence, and his engagement. He would spend years relearning basic skills. The sentencing phase marked a turning point in Canadian legal history. Baumgartner became the first multiple victim offender sentenced under new legislation, allowing consecutive parole and eligibility. The judge described the acts as calculated, cowardly, and rooted in greed. In September 2013, Baumgartner was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 40 years, the harshest such sentence in Canada since capital punishment was abolished. He showed little emotion as the decision was read. Today, the case remains a stark reminder of how ordinary settings can conceal extraordinary danger. It reshaped security procedures, influenced sentencing law, and left a permanent scar on the Edmonton community. For true crime audiences, this story is not just about what happened, but about how quietly it began. No dramatic warning, no obvious signal, just a routine night, a trusted colleague, and a choice that ended 4 lives and destroyed countless others. Case 2. Melanie Alex. In some criminal cases, the most disturbing element is not the crime scene itself, but the quiet, ordinary life that surrounded it. This story begins not with chaos, but with trust, family, and routine. A small household in Quebec, a mother who depended on care, a child barely old enough to walk, and a woman who insisted again and again that she was the true victim. This is the case of Melanie Alex, a woman whose actions would ultimately shatter 2 generations of her own family and leave investigators questioning how danger can sometimes hide in plain sight. Melanie Alex was born in 1974 and lived in the province of Quebec, Canada. On the surface, her life appeared unstable, but not unusual. She struggled with relationships, financial stress, and ongoing conflicts with people close to her. According to her own testimony, she had experienced trauma, betrayal, and mistreatment throughout her life. These claims would later become a central part of her defense. But prosecutors argued that behind this narrative of suffering was a pattern of manipulation and calculated behavior. The first tragedy occurred on January 31, 2001, in L'Acadie, a small community near Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. Melanie was living with her mother, Francine Levesque, who relied on a wheelchair and required assistance in daily life. That morning, emergency services were called to a house fire. By the time responders arrived, Francine was already unresponsive. At first glance, the incident appeared to be a tragic accident, another example of how quickly fire can turn deadly. But forensic findings would later challenge that assumption. Investigators determined that Francine did not pass away because of direct flames, but due to heavy smoke exposure, and that this occurred well before help arrived. More troubling details soon emerged. The fire showed unusual burn patterns, suggesting it did not spread naturally. Even more concerning, toxicology tests revealed that Francine had been given a strong sedative prior to the incident. The medication, oxazepam, had been legally prescribed to Melanie herself. Despite these findings, no immediate charges were filed. Melanie maintained that the incident was an accident and suggested that others may have been responsible. The case remained unresolved and life moved forward. But 2 years later, history repeated itself in a far more devastating way. On May 12, 2003, firefighters were called to another house fire, this time in the community of Saint-Blaise-sur-Richelieu. Inside the home was Melanie's 1-year-old son, Mathis Alex Leblanc. Once again, the scene initially appeared to be a tragic household emergency, and once again, the details told a different story. Fire analysts identified multiple separate points where flames had started, an indicator that the blaze was not accidental. As with the earlier case, toxicology results revealed that the child had been given oxazepam prior to the fire. Medical experts concluded that Matisse had already lost consciousness from smoke long before anyone could intervene. The similarities between the 2 incidents were impossible to ignore. This time, authorities acted swiftly. Melanie Alex was taken into custody on May 16, 2003. During questioning, she made statements that would later become a focal point of the trial. In recorded interviews, she acknowledged administering medication and starting a fire in the kitchen area. However, she later claimed that investigators pressured her into saying things she did not mean, insisting her words had been misrepresented. The trial took place in Longueuil and lasted more than 2 months. Over the course of proceedings, the jury heard extensive testimony from Melanie herself. She described a lifetime of hardship, claiming she had been harmed by family members, romantic partners, and even authorities. According to her account, she was constantly under threat and acted out of fear rather than intent. Prosecutors, however, presented a different picture. They argued that Melanie repeatedly targeted those who were most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves. They pointed to the calculated nature of the fires, the presence of sedatives, and the repeated attempts to shift blame onto others. In both cases, Melanie accused someone else of responsibility, including her brother and her former partner, Stéphane Leblanc, who was not present during the second incident. Expert witnesses explained how the timing of the fires and the medical evidence aligned with deliberate planning. Fire specialists detailed how multiple ignition points are inconsistent with accidents. Medical professionals clarified how oxazepam would have rendered both victims unable to escape or react. Throughout the trial, Melanie displayed little visible emotion. At one point, she described attempting to reach her son through thick smoke, but leaving without him, believing it was already too late. Prosecutors argued that this account contradicted earlier statements and physical evidence. Video recordings of her police interviews were played in court, highlighting inconsistencies in her narrative. After 6 days of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous decision. Melanie Alex was found guilty of first-degree murder and arson in the deaths of both her mother and her son. She was also convicted of attempted murder related to another individual whose identity remains protected. On December 22, 2005, Quebec Superior Court Justice France Charbonneau sentenced Melanie to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the mandatory penalty under Canadian law for such convictions. Additional sentences were issued for related charges to be served concurrently. Reactions outside the courtroom were intense. Melanie's brother publicly stated that he had long believed she was dangerous, describing a history of manipulation and emotional harm. Stéphane Leblanc, the father of Matisse, expressed relief at the verdict, saying that seeing justice served brought him a sense of closure, even though nothing could undo the loss. In the years since, the case of Melanie Alex has remained a chilling reminder that the most devastating crimes do not always come from strangers. Sometimes they emerge from within the family itself, hidden behind stories of victimhood and excuses that collapse under scrutiny. Investigators and legal experts continue to reference this case when discussing patterns of coercive behavior and the misuse of trust. Case 3. Paul Kenneth Bernardo. In the quiet suburbs of Ontario, Canada, a pattern began to emerge that few people could recognize at first. Young women felt watched. Bus stops became places of unease, and beneath the surface of everyday life, a dangerous individual was slowly escalating his behavior in ways that would later shock an entire nation. This is the case of Paul Bernardo, one of the most notorious figures in Canadian criminal history, and the catastrophic failures that allowed his actions to continue for years. Paul Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Toronto, Ontario, into a family that appeared comfortable on the outside, but deeply troubled behind closed doors. His childhood was marked by emotional instability, secrecy, and exposure to harmful behavior that went unaddressed. Despite this, young Paul was often described as polite, charming, and well-behaved, a boy who blended easily into his surroundings and raised few alarms among adults who encountered him. As he grew older, Bernardo became increasingly focused on status, control, and personal success. After graduating high school, he was drawn to motivational sales culture, where confidence, persuasion, and dominance were celebrated. At the same time, his private behavior shifted in darker directions. Friends later described how he enjoyed humiliating others, particularly women, and how his relationships often involved manipulation and aggression rather than affection. In the late 1980s, residents of Scarborough, a district of Toronto, began to experience a series of nighttime attacks. A man targeted young women walking alone, often near bus stops. These incidents followed a similar pattern and became more frequent over time. Media warnings were issued, and fear spread through the community. The unknown attacker would later become known as the Scarborough Rapist, a title that reflected both the location and the severity of the crimes. Between 1987 and 1990, Bernardo carried out numerous assaults, each one more brazen than the last. Some victims were teenagers, others were young adults, but all were chosen because they were vulnerable and alone. Despite eyewitness descriptions and even a composite sketch released to the public, investigators struggled to identify the offender. In a tragic twist, Bernardo himself was questioned by police in 1990, provided samples, and was ultimately released because he appeared calm, educated, and cooperative. This decision would have devastating consequences. Around this time, Bernardo was in a relationship with Karla Homolka, a woman who would later play a central role in the most infamous chapter of the case. To outsiders, they appeared to be a normal young couple planning a future together. Privately, however, they shared a disturbing dynamic built on secrecy, control, and mutual reinforcement of harmful behavior. The first confirmed death connected to the couple was Tammy Homolka, Karla's younger sister. In December 1990, Tammy passed away under circumstances initially ruled accidental. Authorities accepted the explanation without deeper investigation, despite inconsistencies and warning signs. Only years later would the truth come to light, revealing that her death was the result of deliberate actions carried out inside the family home while others slept nearby. Following this, the couple relocated to St. Catharines, Ontario. What appeared to be a fresh start was anything but. In June 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey disappeared after missing her curfew. She was last seen alone late at night, locked out of her house. Days later, remains were discovered in a nearby body of water, leading investigators to uncover evidence that pointed back to Bernardo and Homolka. Despite growing public fear and ongoing investigations, the full extent of the couple's actions remained hidden. It wasn't until April 1992 that the case reached a breaking point. 15-year-old Kristen French was taken in broad daylight while walking home from school. Multiple witnesses saw parts of the incident, and police immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Search efforts intensified, but critical information was mishandled and opportunities to intervene were lost. Kristen's body was found weeks later, confirming the worst fears of her family and community. With 3 young victims now linked by location, method, and circumstance, pressure mounted on law enforcement to find answers. Behind the scenes, forensic evidence finally began to connect the dots that had been missed years earlier. DNA results tied Bernardo to the earlier Scarborough attacks, exposing a long trail of investigative failures. In February 1993, Paul Bernardo was arrested and charged. The subsequent trial revealed details that stunned the public, including recorded evidence and testimony that demonstrated the depth of planning and the involvement of more than one person. Bernardo attempted to shift blame, claiming others were responsible, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1995, Bernardo was convicted of multiple serious offenses, including 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was later designated a dangerous offender, making any release extremely unlikely. He remains incarcerated under strict conditions due to safety concerns. Karla Homolka, in contrast, received a significantly lighter sentence after agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors. Her plea deal sparked outrage across Canada, especially after it was revealed that key evidence had been withheld during negotiations. Although she served her sentence and was released in 2005, public reaction remains deeply divided, and her case is often cited as one of the most controversial plea agreements in Canadian history. The Bernardo case led to sweeping changes in how police handle violent offenders, manage interagency communication, and assess suspect credibility. Public inquiries exposed systemic failures, forcing reforms aimed at preventing similar tragedies. For many Canadians, the case is a permanent reminder of how appearances can deceive and how crucial it is to take early warning signs seriously. Case 4. Catherine Andrus. On a quiet residential street in Port Hope, a case unfolded that would leave an entire community questioning how well we ever truly know the people closest to us. Behind closed doors in what appeared to be an ordinary family home, events took place that would later be described in court as senseless, calculated, and deeply unsettling. This is the story of Catherine Andrus, a woman whose life became forever defined by one irreversible night in September 2009. Catherine Andrus was born on November 27, 1959, and for many years lived what seemed to be a stable domestic life. She shared her home with her long-term partner, Michael LeBlanc, a 53-year-old man known by friends and family as gentle, generous, and devoted to those he loved. The couple had been together for more than 16 years, forming what outwardly looked like a typical blended family. Michael had even legally adopted Catherine's teenage son, treating him as his own. But beneath this image of normalcy, serious tensions were quietly building. Financial pressure weighed heavily on the household. Court records later revealed mounting debt, overdue bills, and frozen credit cards. These struggles were reportedly worsened by Catherine's gambling habits, which placed further strain on the relationship. Despite these issues, there was no clear warning sign that the situation would end in tragedy. Friends and relatives would later say they never imagined such an outcome. On the night of September 23, 2009, nothing appeared unusual from the outside. The family home on Pochon Avenue was silent, and Michael went to bed believing he would wake up to an ordinary day. Instead, during the early hours of September 24th, his life came to a sudden and violent end while he was asleep. According to court findings, he was taken completely by surprise. What followed was a brutal and sustained attack that left no chance for him to defend himself. Later that morning, the unimaginable discovery was made by Catherine's teenage son, just one day after celebrating his 16th birthday. When he entered the bedroom, he found Michael unresponsive. Emergency services were called, and the home quickly became an active investigation scene. From the start, something about the situation did not feel right to investigators. Authorities initially considered the possibility of a break-in gone wrong. The bedroom appeared disturbed, and personal items, including Michael's wallet, were missing. However, as detectives examined the scene more closely, inconsistencies began to emerge. There were no clear signs of forced entry, and the nature of Michael's injuries suggested something far more personal than a random intrusion. A post-incident examination revealed that Michael had suffered multiple severe impacts to the head. Experts testified that any one of these injuries could have been fatal. The conclusion was unavoidable. This was not an accident, and it was not the work of an unknown intruder. The focus of the investigation gradually shifted inward, toward the people closest to the victim. In the days following Michael's passing, Catherine presented herself as a grieving partner. She attended the funeral and even delivered an emotional eulogy that moved many in attendance. To friends and extended family, her sorrow appeared genuine. Yet behind the scenes, investigators were piecing together a very different narrative. Police discovered that items believed to be taken during the supposed robbery were later found in Catherine's possession, including inside the vehicle she had been driving and in her personal locker. This discovery seriously undermined the theory of an outside offender. Further investigation uncovered troubling deceptions that had been ongoing for months before Michael's death. Court testimony revealed that Catherine had led Michael to believe he was about to receive a significant tax refund, money he thought would help ease their financial troubles. In reality, documents from Revenue Canada showed the opposite. Michael actually owed thousands of dollars. Additionally, Catherine had told friends and family that she was undergoing medical treatment for breast cancer, a claim that was later proven to be false. On the morning of September 24th, Catherine went to work as if nothing had happened, stopping along the way to dispose of evidence connected to the incident. The object used in the attack was never recovered. These actions, prosecutors argued, demonstrated planning rather than panic. Nearly a year passed before the case reached a turning point. On September 13, 2010, Catherine was arrested after an undercover operation led her to admit responsibility for Michael's death. The confession confirmed what investigators had come to believe. The scene had been deliberately staged to mislead authorities. Catherine was initially charged with first-degree murder. However, during court proceedings in Oshawa, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The court accepted the plea, and on November 27, 2012, her 53rd birthday, she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 12 years. The presiding judge described the act as vicious, cowardly, and calculated. Prosecutors emphasized that although the legal classification was second-degree murder, the emotional impact was immeasurable. Catherine stood to gain an estimated $370,000 through life insurance policies and pension benefits following Michael's death, leading the court to conclude that financial motivation played a significant role. Victim impact statements delivered during sentencing painted a heartbreaking picture of the loss. Friends described Michael as a loyal companion and a gentle giant. His siblings spoke of shattered trust and a grief that would never fully heal. His daughters shared the pain of knowing their children would grow up without their grandfather, and that no new memories could ever be made. In her final statement to the court, Catherine accepted responsibility for her actions. She stated that she pleaded guilty to avoid putting the families through a painful trial. She did not ask for forgiveness, but expressed remorse and apologized to everyone affected. She also said that if she were ever released, she would not return to Port Hope or the surrounding area. Catherine Andrus became eligible to apply for parole in September 2022. In addition to her sentence, she was ordered to provide a DNA sample and was permanently prohibited from possessing firearms. Case 5. Maurice Boucher. The name Maurice Boucher is deeply connected to one of the darkest chapters in Canada's organized crime history. For years, his reputation cast a long shadow over Quebec, not just within biker circles, but across the entire justice system. Known by the nickname Mom, Boucher rose from a troubled upbringing to become a central figure in a violent struggle for control, leaving behind a legacy that still sparks debate, fear, and fascination among true crime audiences today. Boucher was born on June 21, 1953, in Kausascal, Quebec, and spent much of his childhood in the Hochelaga-Maisonneuve district of Montreal, an area marked by poverty and limited opportunity. His family relocated when he was very young, and by his teenage years, Boucher had already dropped out of school. He took on various low-paying jobs, but dissatisfaction with his financial situation and growing involvement in substance use gradually pushed him toward illegal activity. His early adulthood was shaped by repeated encounters with law enforcement. In the mid-1970s, Boucher was arrested for a series of break-ins and later for an armed robbery, resulting in multiple prison sentences. These periods of incarceration proved pivotal, exposing him to hardened criminals and reinforcing a worldview where intimidation and loyalty were considered essential tools for survival. By the early 1980s, Boucher had aligned himself with a white supremacist motorcycle group known as the SS, based in Pointe-aux-Trembles. It was during this time that he formed a close relationship with Salvatore Cazzetta, a man who would later become both an ally and a rival. Their shared ambition eventually placed them in the orbit of the Hells Angels, which was expanding its influence across Canada. A turning point came in 1985 with the Lennoxville incident, an internal purge that shocked even seasoned figures in the criminal underworld. Members of a rival Hells Angels chapter were lured to a gathering and eliminated, their remains later discovered in the St. Lawrence River. The event cemented the group's ruthless reputation, but also fractured internal loyalty. Cazzetta reportedly viewed the incident as an unforgivable betrayal and distanced himself from Boucher's vision of power. In 1986, Cazzetta went on to establish the Rock Machine, setting the stage for years of rivalry. Meanwhile, Boucher formally joined the Hells Angels in Montreal in the late 1980s and rapidly climbed the ranks. By the early 1990s, he was regarded as one of the most influential biker leaders in Quebec, connected to large-scale illicit trade and financial operations. The conflict escalated dramatically in 1994 following Cazzetta's arrest on drug-related charges. With the Rock Machine temporarily weakened, Boucher, now president of the Hells Angels Montreal chapter, moved aggressively to assert dominance. His objective was clear: complete control over street-level distribution and biker-affiliated operations throughout Montreal, and eventually the entire province. Resistance from rival groups quickly led to open conflict. This struggle became known as the Quebec Biker War, a period marked by repeated attacks, explosive devices, and widespread fear. One of the most tragic moments occurred in August 1994, when an explosive detonated near a schoolyard, fatally injuring an 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desrochers. The incident sent shockwaves through Quebec and intensified public pressure on authorities to dismantle biker networks. As the conflict continued, Boucher helped form the Hells Angels Nomads chapter in 1995, a powerful faction not tied to a single territory. This group consisted of the most influential members in the province and allowed Boucher to exert control across regions without traditional limitations. Law enforcement agencies viewed the Nomads as a strategic evolution designed to evade prosecution and consolidate authority. The most consequential allegations against Boucher emerged in 1997 when two Quebec correctional officers, Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau, were targeted in separate incidents. According to prosecutors, these acts were intended to destabilize the justice system and send a message that no one involved in law enforcement was beyond reach. Both victims were reportedly chosen at random, amplifying the sense of intimidation surrounding the crimes. Boucher was initially acquitted in 1998, but the case did not end there. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informant testimony continued to build. In 2000, an appeals court overturned the acquittal due to judicial errors, leading to Boucher's rearrest. The retrial became one of the most heavily secured legal proceedings in Canadian history, reflecting concerns over jury safety and potential interference. A key witness, Stéphane Gagné, testified that he had acted under direct orders from Boucher's inner circle and was later praised for carrying out the attacks. Despite defense arguments questioning witness credibility, the jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's narrative. In May 2002, Maurice "Mom" Boucher was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He received an automatic life sentence with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. Boucher was transferred to the super maximum security penitentiary in Sainte-Anne-de-Plaine, north of Montreal. Even behind bars, his name continued to generate attention. Over the years, reports emerged of multiple assaults against him, reflecting shifting power dynamics within the prison system and the broader criminal landscape. Analysts noted that his influence, once immense, appeared to be steadily declining. In 2010, reports surfaced that Boucher had been injured during a confrontation with other inmates. While officials released limited details, crime experts suggested the incident symbolized the fading authority of a man who once dominated Quebec's biker world. As large-scale police operations dismantled major networks, the era that Boucher helped define slowly came to an end. Case 6. Penny Patricia Boudreau. In January 2008, a small Canadian town became the center of a case that would leave an entire community searching for answers and struggling to understand how trust inside a family could completely collapse. This is the case of Penny Boudreau, a woman whose public image during a missing child investigation sharply contrasted with the truth later revealed in court. According to official records, this case was not about strangers or chance, but about decisions made behind closed doors. Carissa Boudreau was 12 years old when she was reported missing on January 27, 2008. Her mother told police that after an argument, Carissa stayed in the car while she briefly went into a grocery store. When she returned, the child was gone. What initially appeared to be a possible runaway situation quickly became something far more serious. Search teams were mobilized, posters spread across the province, and the community of Bridgewater held on to hope as days passed with no sign of the girl. During the first 2 weeks, Penny Boudreau appeared repeatedly before cameras, making emotional appeals and asking for help finding her daughter. Police stated at the time that there was no immediate evidence of a criminal act, and investigators continued to follow every lead. As winter weather worsened, concern grew over how a child could survive outdoors for so long. The case dominated local news, and many residents described Carissa as Bridgewater's daughter, even if they had never met her. Everything changed when a passerby discovered a body near the La Have River on February 9, 2008. Forensic teams confirmed that the remains belonged to Carissa, and authorities officially reclassified the investigation as a homicide case. Police emphasized that this was not believed to be a random incident and stated that the victim likely knew the person responsible. This announcement sent shockwaves through the town, replacing hope with grief and fear. Despite widespread rumors, investigators remained cautious and avoided releasing sensitive details. For several months, no arrests were made, though police maintained that the case was progressing behind the scenes. The public, however, grew increasingly suspicious, especially as inconsistencies in the timeline began to surface. Penny Boudreau continued to participate in memorials and public events, reinforcing the image of a grieving parent. In June 2008, 4 months after Carissa's body was found, police arrested Penny Boudreau and charged her with first-degree murder. Authorities stated that the evidence indicated only one person was responsible. The arrest stunned the community and reframed every public moment that had come before. Court documents later revealed that undercover officers had played a critical role in the investigation, posing as individuals who claimed they could interfere with evidence. Boudreaux's conversations with them became central to the case. According to the agreed statement of facts presented in court, the motive centered on an ultimatum from Boudreaux's boyfriend, who reportedly told her that he could not continue the relationship if Carissa remained in their lives. Prosecutors stated that Boudreaux viewed her daughter as an obstacle rather than a responsibility. On the night of January 27th, she drove Carissa to a remote area where the fatal act occurred. The court records describe a deliberate series of actions rather than a sudden emotional loss of control. Afterward, prosecutors said, Boudreaux attempted to mislead investigators by disposing of personal items and creating a false narrative suggesting her daughter had run away. She then returned home and reported Carissa missing, setting in motion the extensive search that involved volunteers, police, and aerial teams. This contrast between private actions and public performance became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case for many observers. In January 2009, Penny Boudreaux pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. As part of the plea agreement, the family was spared a lengthy trial and the uncertainty that comes with it. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 20 years. During sentencing, the court emphasized the irreversible betrayal of trust and the lasting harm done not only to the victim, but to the community as a whole. Carissa's father publicly rejected Boudreaux's apology, calling it insincere and stating that justice had been served. Extended family members described Carissa as creative, shy, and gentle, a child who loved music and animals. The court acknowledged these statements, reinforcing that Carissa was not defined by how her life ended, but by who she was before it. Investigators later confirmed that there was no evidence the boyfriend directly instructed or assisted in the crime, and no charges were filed against him. Authorities stressed that responsibility rested solely with Penny Boudreaux. This clarification was important in preventing further speculation and ensuring the case remained grounded in verified facts. The lasting impact of this case continues to be felt in Bridgewater. Memorials, vigils, and anniversaries serve as reminders of how deeply the town was affected. For law enforcement, the case stands as an example of how patience, undercover operations, and careful evidence gathering can reveal the truth even when initial appearances are misleading. Case 7. Michael Breer. On a quiet residential street in Toronto, an ordinary spring evening in 2003 ended in a way that would leave an entire city searching for answers. Parents would later describe how the sense of safety they once felt walking these sidewalks was permanently changed. This case is not just about one individual, but about missed warning signs, systemic questions, and a tragedy that still resonates today. This is the story of Michael Breer and the loss of a child named Holly Jones. At the time, Toronto was a city used to big headlines, but few prepared residents for what was about to unfold. Michael Breer was born in 1968 and originally came from Montreal. By 2003, he was living alone in downtown Toronto, working as a software developer. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared quiet, reserved, and largely unremarkable. He kept to himself, had no known criminal record, and blended easily into the urban landscape. This outward normalcy would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. On May 13, 2003, 10-year-old Holly Jones was walking near her home, a routine activity for a child in her neighborhood. What happened next would shock not only her family, but the entire country. Investigators later determined that Breer encountered Holly by chance and lured her inside his residence. Once inside, events escalated rapidly, leading to the child's death by strangulation. The crime did not end there, as efforts were made to conceal what had happened. In the days that followed, parts of Holly's remains were discarded in and around Toronto Harbor and Lake Ontario. Despite attempts to hide the evidence, the remains were discovered, triggering an intense and emotional investigation. The disappearance of a child mobilized Toronto police on a massive scale. Hundreds of officers canvassed neighborhoods, reviewed surveillance footage, and interviewed residents. Authorities made the unusual decision to request voluntary DNA samples from men living in the area where Holly had last been seen. This move sparked debate, but investigators felt the urgency justified extraordinary measures. Briere drew attention when he refused to provide a DNA sample, raising suspicion among detectives. On June 20th, 2003, he was arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community as residents struggled to reconcile the image of a quiet software worker with the nature of the crime. Then Police Chief Julian Fantino publicly expressed frustration, calling for broader investigative tools to prevent similar tragedies. His comments ignited a national conversation about privacy, public safety, and how far authorities should go when searching for suspects. In court, Briere chose to plead guilty, sparing Holly's family a lengthy and painful trial. He described his actions using words like cruel and nightmarish, acknowledging the gravity of what he had done. The court heard that his actions were influenced by harmful online material, a claim that fueled further public debate about internet regulation and accountability. In June 2004, Briere was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Under Canadian law, this was the most severe sentence available. The courtroom was filled with grief as Holly's mother sat through the proceedings, visibly overwhelmed by the details being read aloud. Family representatives spoke of a child who loved life, laughed easily, and had her future stolen in an instant. The emotional weight of the sentencing hearing underscored the irreversible nature of the loss. Public reaction was swift and intense. Newspapers, including the Globe and Mail, covered the case extensively, examining not only the crime, but the broader societal questions it raised. Some voices called for stricter monitoring of online spaces, while civil liberties advocates warned against overreach. The balance between protecting children and preserving individual rights became a central theme in the aftermath. In the neighborhood where Holly lived, parents changed routines. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone, even in daylight. The sense of community trust was fractured, replaced by caution and fear. Memorials appeared, flowers and stuffed animals lining fences and sidewalks, symbols of a city mourning one of its own. In statements read to the court, Holly's parents emphasized that their daughter's spirit would not be defined by the way she died. They spoke of her kindness, her humor, and the joy she brought to others, urging lawmakers to ensure that no other family would endure the same pain. Briere has remained incarcerated since his arrest, held under protective custody due to the nature of his crime. He did not turn himself in, and investigators later emphasized that it was forensic evidence that ultimately connected him to the scene. This fact reinforced the importance of scientific methods in modern investigations, while also highlighting the limitations of relying on appearances or assumptions. Case 8. Cheryl Margaret Dell. Late at night in a quiet rural town, a man sat alone listening to music from his past, writing down his thoughts as he drank a bottle of wine he believed was harmless. What he did not know was that those pages would become some of the most haunting evidence ever presented in a Canadian courtroom. This is the disturbing case of Cheryl Margaret Dell, a story of manipulation, deception, and calculated betrayal, hidden behind intimacy and trust. In the early 1990s, Cheryl Dell lived in the small community of Killaloe, located in Ontario. She was married to Scott Dell, a devoted father and husband who, according to friends and family, remained emotionally attached to his wife even after their relationship collapsed. Their marriage was turbulent, marked by separation, accusations, and repeated reconciliation attempts. But Scott never stopped believing that they might reunite. By 1995, Scott was dealing with serious health concerns and emotional isolation. Despite their separation, he continued to trust Cheryl, speaking with her regularly and relying on her guidance. Prosecutors would later argue that this trust became the foundation for a carefully planned act meant to permanently remove him from her life. According to court findings in late December 1995, Cheryl allegedly provided Scott with a bottle of wine as a gift. What Scott did not know was that the drink had been contaminated with a toxic substance commonly found in automotive products. Prosecutors stated that Cheryl encouraged him to drink it while keeping him emotionally engaged over the phone throughout the night, reinforcing feelings of nostalgia and hope. During those final hours, Scott wrote several handwritten notes. Listening to love songs, he described memories, emotions, and dreams of reconciliation. These notes were later recovered by investigators and became central to the case, offering a chilling window into a man who believed he was reconnecting with the love of his life, unaware of the danger unfolding. Scott Dell was found unresponsive in his farmhouse on December 29, 1995. Initially, authorities believed his passing may have been self-inflicted, influenced by illness and emotional distress. However, that conclusion would later be challenged when new information emerged. Nearly 2 years later, a former partner of Cheryl, Nancy Fillmore, approached police. According to investigators, she claimed that Cheryl had openly discussed harming Scott and had involved her in obtaining the toxic substance used. Fillmore stated that she witnessed the wine being prepared and later realized the seriousness of what had occurred. This revelation dramatically shifted the direction of the investigation. In December 1997, Cheryl Dell was formally charged in connection with Scott's death. Prosecutors argued that the act was motivated by financial gain, custody disputes, and a desire to fully control her future without interference. The case grew even darker in August 1997, when Nancy Fillmore herself lost her life in a suspicious residential fire. Authorities alleged that the fire was deliberately set to prevent her from testifying, though legal proceedings surrounding that incident followed a separate and complex path. A teenage male was later convicted in connection with the fire, while Cheryl faced additional allegations related to influencing events leading up to it. In 2001, after a lengthy trial without a jury, the court found Cheryl Dell guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Scott Dell. The judge concluded that the evidence demonstrated deliberate planning, emotional manipulation, and intent. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Case 9. Camille Clairot. In quiet neighborhoods, danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it moves in silence, hiding behind routine, familiarity, and trust. In Ottawa, a city known for order and calm, one man lived for decades without raising alarm. Neighbors saw him as a loner. Co-workers knew him as unremarkable. To the outside world, Camille Clairot appeared invisible. But over the course of 20 years, 3 women connected to him disappeared, one after another, leaving behind unanswered questions, grieving families, and a trail of deception that would only come to light years later. This case is not about sudden rage or a single breaking point. It is about patience, manipulation, and how absence itself can become a weapon. Each disappearance was treated separately, explained away with stories that seemed plausible at the time. Only when investigators began to connect the pieces did the full scope of what had happened begin to surface. Clairot was born in 1954 and spent much of his adult life drifting between modest jobs and unstable relationships. He lived quietly in Ottawa, often described by relatives as distant and emotionally closed off. He had family, children, and acquaintances, yet he remained on the margins of their lives. This isolation would later help him avoid scrutiny, as no one seemed to be watching closely. The first woman tied to his story was Lise Roy. They married in the late 1980s, presenting themselves as an ordinary young couple building a future together. But behind closed doors, the relationship deteriorated. In 1990, Roy suddenly vanished. Clairot told authorities and neighbors that she had left him, claiming she had gone to Montreal after a domestic dispute. The explanation, while vague, was not unheard of. Police accepted it, and the case quietly faded into the background. Roy was only 27 years old. Years passed. Life moved on. Clairot remained in the same area, blending into the routine of daily life. In 1992, he entered a new relationship with Jean Rock, a woman who struggled with health issues and maintained a complicated relationship with her family. Their partnership was turbulent, marked by frequent separations and reconciliations. In 2003, Rock disappeared as well. Once again, Clairot offered explanations. He suggested she had chosen to cut ties and start fresh elsewhere. Because she had not been formally reported missing, no immediate investigation followed. What made this case especially disturbing was not only the disappearance, but what came after. For years, Rock's family received handwritten letters signed with her name. The messages described a new life, a partner, even children. They were personal, emotional, and convincing enough to keep hope alive. These letters delayed suspicion and prolonged the family's uncertainty, creating a false reality that masked the truth. The third disappearance finally shattered the pattern. In 2010, Paula Leclerc, a 64-year-old neighbor of Clairot, went missing from her apartment building. Unlike the previous cases, her absence was noticed quickly. Her son became concerned when he could not reach her and went to check on her home. Inside, he found unfamiliar belongings replacing his mother's possessions. Clairot claimed she had gone on vacation and allowed him to stay in her apartment. The story did not sit right. Police were contacted, and this time questions escalated rapidly. Investigators soon discovered that Clairot had moved into Leclerc's apartment shortly after she disappeared. Evidence began to mount, and under questioning, he admitted responsibility for her death. This confession triggered a deeper review of his past relationships. Cold cases were reopened. Properties he had lived in were searched. In wooded areas near former residences, investigators uncovered human remains. Forensic analysis would eventually confirm what families had feared for decades. The remains found beneath a backyard garden belonged to Lise Roy. Other remains recovered from wooded areas were linked to John Rock. The stories Clairot had told for years unraveled under scientific scrutiny. What once appeared to be unrelated disappearances were now clearly connected. A long, carefully concealed pattern had finally been exposed. In court, Clairot pleaded guilty to 3 counts related to the deaths of Roy, Rock, and Leclerc. He admitted that his actions were driven not by momentary loss of control, but by convenience and self-interest. In Leclerc's case, he wanted her apartment. In the earlier cases, he described the women as obstacles in his life. The coldness of these admissions left a lasting impression on everyone present. During sentencing, family members delivered emotional statements. They spoke about birthdays missed, years lost to uncertainty, and the pain of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. One father described welcoming Clairot into his home, only to later realize how deeply he had been deceived. These statements highlighted the long-term damage caused not only by the acts themselves, but by the lies that followed. In 2012, Clairot was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The judge stated that given the calculated nature of his actions and the length of time over which they occurred, society needed permanent protection from him. With that sentence, the legal process ended, but the emotional impact did not. Case 10. Kelly Marie Ellard. On a cold November night in 1997, a quiet stretch of shoreline near Victoria, British Columbia became the setting for a case that would shock an entire nation and permanently change how Canada talked about bullying, youth violence, and responsibility. What began as rumors whispered through a high school hallway would later unfold into one of the most disturbing and closely followed criminal cases in Canadian history. At the center of it was a 14-year-old girl named Rena Verk, whose search for acceptance ended in a tragic and irreversible way. Rena lived in Saanich, part of the Greater Victoria area. She came from a large family who had immigrated from India and practiced the Jehovah's Witness faith, making them a minority within a minority in their local community. Those who knew Rena described her as lonely, eager to fit in, and willing to tolerate mistreatment if it meant being included. At school, she struggled socially and became the target of ridicule from a group of teenagers who were heavily influenced by a tough, gang-inspired image popular at the time. By the fall of 1997, tensions had been building for months. Rumors, accusations, and jealousy circulated among a group of teens who all knew each other through school and group homes. On the evening of November 14, Rena was invited to what she believed was a small gathering near the Craigflower Bridge. Instead of friendship, she encountered hostility. Several teenagers surrounded her, and what followed was a sustained physical assault, while others stood by and watched. Witnesses later described acts meant to humiliate and intimidate her, including cigarette burns and repeated strikes. Eventually, one of the girls told the group to stop, and Rena, injured but conscious, managed to walk away. For a brief moment, it seemed the worst was over. But 2 individuals followed her into the darkness. One was Kelly Ellard, who was only 15 years old at the time. The other was Warren Glowatsky, 16. According to court testimony, the pair caught up with Rena near the water. She was struck again, forced closer to the shoreline, and ultimately held under the surface until she stopped moving. The medical examiner later confirmed that the cause of death was drowning, though severe head injuries alone could have been fatal. Rena's disappearance quickly became the subject of gossip at Shoreline Secondary School. Students and even some teachers heard rumors that something terrible had happened, yet no one came forward. For more than a week, Rena was considered missing. It was not until November 22nd that police, using a helicopter, discovered her partially clothed body washed ashore in the Gorge Inlet. She was 14 years old. The investigation that followed exposed the involvement of multiple teenagers, later referred to collectively as the Shoreline Six. 6 girls were charged for their roles in the initial assault and eventually convicted of causing bodily harm. Their sentences ranged from conditional terms to short periods of custody, reflecting their ages and levels of involvement. The focus of the case, however, centered on Allard and Glowatsky. Glowatsky admitted to taking part in the attack and later cooperated with authorities. In 1999, he was convicted of second-degree murder and received a life sentence, with eligibility to apply for parole after 7 years due to his age at the time of the offense. During his incarceration, he expressed remorse and participated in restorative justice processes that included meetings with Rena's parents. In 2010, he was released on full parole. Ellard's legal journey was far more complex. She was tried 3 separate times. Her first conviction in 2000 was overturned on appeal due to errors in how the jury had been instructed. A second trial in 2004 ended with a deadlocked jury and a mistrial. In 2005, a third trial resulted in another conviction for second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 7 years. If you want more true crime stories explained clearly and respectfully, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Your support really helps the channel grow.